Today, we're going to be historical detectives. We're diving into a really interesting puzzle. It involves two ancient texts, both linked to the very same person, but they get treated with completely different standards of evidence. So we're going to try to figure out why the rules of the game seem to change depending on the artifact, and why how we investigate something is just as important as what we actually find. So here's the central mystery we're unpacking. How is it possible for smart people, using these same kinds of analytical methods, to look at two very similar historical documents and walk away with completely opposite conclusions? This isn't just a simple disagreement. It feels like the goalposts are moving, depending on which text is under the microscope. And the two texts at the heart of all this, the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham, both have sparked some seriously intense debates, which actually makes them the perfect case studies for what we're about to get into. Okay, this is where things start to get a little muddy. Imagine a detective who uses a magnifying glass to inspect one clue, but then pulls out a telescope to look at the next one. That's kind of what's happening here. Critics and defenders of these texts often seem to pull out completely different toolkits for each book, and that's what creates a ton of confusion and leads to claims of a double standard. So to cut through all that confusion, we need a consistent framework. So let's build our own investigator's toolkit. It's really simple. It just has two essential tools that are going to help us analyze any historical claim fairly and consistently. First up in our toolkit is provenance. Honestly, the easiest way to think about this is like the chain of custody for a piece of evidence at a crime scene. It's all about the object's backstory. Where did it come from? Who's had it? How did it get from point A to point B? We're basically tracing its journey through time. And our second tool is forensics. So if provenance is the backstory, forensics is kind of like the lab work. This is where we get hands-on and examine the object itself. We're analyzing the text, the language, the materials, whatever we have, to try and figure out what it is, who might have created it, and what it's really trying to say. So let's just lock this in. It really boils down to two simple questions. Provenance asks, where did it come from? And forensics asks, what is it made of? It's the history of the object versus the science on the object. Okay, now that we have our toolkit, let's see what happens when we apply it to our case studies. All right, first up, the Egyptian papyri that are connected to the Book of Abraham. Let's pull out our new toolkit and see what the evidence profile really looks like. Let's break this down. So, on the provenance side, the story is pretty straightforward. We know Joseph Smith got these Egyptian papyri in 1835. Some were lost in a fire, but then, amazingly, some fragments were rediscovered back in the 1960s. But now look at the forensics. This is where things get really contentious. When modern Egyptologists looked at those surviving fragments, they identified them as pretty common Egyptian funeral texts, not a lost book written by the biblical patriarch Abraham. And that right there is the absolute core of the debate for this book. Because a physical artifact actually exists, we have the papyri, the argument becomes almost entirely about forensics. The main critique is this huge mismatch between what the experts say the papyri are and the text that was supposedly produced from them. Okay, let's switch gears and turn our attention to the second case, the Book of Mormon. Now we're going to use the exact same toolkit, provenance and forensics, and see what its evidence profile looks like. And whoa, this is where things get turned completely upside down. For provenance, we have the opposite problem. There's no physical artifact for anyone to test today. The entire origin story rests on testimony. The story of Joseph Smith receiving golden plates from an angel and the witnesses who said they saw or handled them. And on the forensic side, well, the text itself is this complex mix. Some scholars point to what they see as ancient literary patterns, while others point to language and ideas that feel very 19th century. And there it is. Did you see what just happened? With the Book of Mormon, the entire debate flips from forensics to provenance. Suddenly, the critical focus isn't about analyzing an artifact, it's about the lack of an artifact. The whole argument shifts to the origin story and the credibility of the witnesses, all because there are no plates to actually put under a microscope. It's a total reversal. Now, there's one more really important piece to this puzzle we just can't ignore. The man at the center of it all. Joseph Smith himself. Because his personal background, his age, and his education, they add a whole new layer to this question of authorship. I mean, just look at this timeline for a second. In 1829, at just 24 years old, Joseph Smith dictates the Book of Mormon. We're talking about a huge, complex text in what's said to be about 65 days. Just 5 years later, at 29, he produces the Book of Abraham, and his most complex, expansive theological ideas, they come even later in his life. So this just tees up this huge question of plausibility. On one side, you have critics asking, could a 24-year-old with very little formal schooling really have written these massive, complex books all by himself? Maybe he was some kind of creative genius who was just brilliant at pulling from his environment. But on the other side, defenders see this exact same progression as evidence of a prophet being taught slowly, step by step, or line upon line, by a divine source. So where does all this leave us? Well, it really brings us back to that first idea of intellectual consistency. If we're going to evaluate these claims in a fair way, we have to use the same rules for both cases, right? You just can't switch your toolkit halfway through an investigation and expect to get a clear answer. And this brings us to a really fascinating point that often gets lost in the shuffle. With all the back and forth about provenance, missing plates, and witness testimony, the text of the Book of Mormon itself often gets pushed to the side. But when you think about it, the words on the page are the only artifact we have left. It's a massive piece of forensic evidence that's right there for anyone to examine. So we can actually walk away from this with a simple little checklist for our investigator's toolkit. Step 1. Just identify the tools being used. Is the argument you're hearing about provenance or forensics? Step 2. Ask yourself, is that tool being applied consistently? Are the goalposts moving? Step 3. Don't forget to analyze the text itself as a key piece of forensic evidence. And finally, step 4. Always consider the human factor, the plausibility of the author's story. Which kind of leaves us with one last big question to chew on. When we're evaluating history, any history, is it possible that how we choose to look is just as important as what we find? That the very framework we decide to use ends up shaping the answers we get? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for digging into this with us.